So I'm Zandra Yeaman and I am the Hunterian's Curator of Discomfort based at the University of Glasgow. I'm currently on secondment from the Coalition for Racial Equality and Right. To set the scene, I will give you some information about myself. So for the past 2 decades, I have worked in third sector organisations that have had a focus on race, gender, class, disability and socio-economics. I studied part-time while working, and in 2014 I received my postgrad in citizenship and human rights from Glasgow Caledonian University. Social policy informs all my work, looking at ways we can and should shape a society that is equitable. Now, I grew up in Glasgow and visited museums often, and I realised that museums play a part in the identity of nations and cities and tell stories that influence and shape our national identity. And through my work at the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, coordinating Black History Month in Scotland, I could see the connections with Scotland's past and how this shows up in our present, how the history of African, Caribbean and Asian people is minimised or not there at all. I realised I could use our history in my anti-racism practice to highlight issues of racism that are present today. Now, those of us working in this area have always faced the accusation that we are being political. I would state that museums are political. Many of these memorials have their legacies rooted in colonialism. They have collections donated from donors who benefited directly or indirectly from the proceeds of empire, colonialism, slavery and migration. Another accusation is sometimes because we refer to people as white or self-identifying as white, it may feel like I am reinforcing the problematic categories of race that we're trying to deconstruct. But at the same time, it is important for me to signal that I recognise that even as racial categories are a problematic social construct, racism, as well as the benefits that white-skinned individuals experience, are very real. We have to talk about it, and understanding our history can help us to unpack these systemic inequities. So how do we start to change the historical bias that excludes the experience of marginalised groups? Now, addressing historical bias is an upfront challenge of white supremacy. It will take more than inviting communities into the space to help improve an exhibition. It's an overhauling of the entire system. Otherwise, what happens is museums are merely replicating systems of colonialism, exploiting communities, and in particular, people of colour for their emotional and intellectual labour without equity, respect and power. It's worth noting that last year a survey ranked museum curators within the top 5 most trusted professions to tell them the truth, and this was behind nurses, librarians and doctors, but alongside teachers. It's also worth noting that we have had more than 50 years of racial equality legislation in this country, and there has been some change, but we still see people of colour being disproportionately impacted negatively in society and in our institutions. So we know the problem exists, and I would say we need to interrogate this. And one of the ways to do this is to explore the history that has brought us to this point and address our complicity in propping up current institutional structures. So learning from the past should inform us about the present so we can change the future. So I thought for today, it would be good to share with you some of the work of Curating Discomfort. So while curators are usually recognised as custodians of collections, as Curator of Discomfort, it's people I'm interested in. I facilitate the uncomfortable conversations we need to have if we want to increase audience diversity and make museums relevant, but more important, to address the legacies of empire, slavery and colonialism. It's people who make museums, not only the objects and belongings on display. So I've put together a short presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. So as I said, I'm on to comment from the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, and while I was there, I was responsible for coordinating the Black History Month programme. And the first coordinated programme, which was before my time, for Black History Month in Scotland was launched in 2001. And the motivation for this came from the anti-racist movement. It was created to highlight the history of African, Caribbean, and Asian people in this country. The Black History Month is also about solidarity and the building of allies in relation to shared and common experiences of racism. It is used to spotlight the history of Black people who often have a direct link to Scotland through empire, slavery, colonialism, and migration. And if you go to the web page, you see the address at the top of the slide here. You will see the archive of these programmes, and they are a mixture of celebration and history. And a lot of that history, I'm delighted to say, is now being discussed. We never wanted Black History Month to ever be 1 month a year. So it's good to see the movement towards our history being included in the school curriculum and at the forefront within culture and heritage. But if we really want to address the legacy and the historical bias, we need to look at where that bias came from. So we hear words like decolonisation used a lot, but do we understand that to do that, we first need to look at the ideology and concepts that underpin colonisation? So I thought a good start would be to talk through some often asked questions. So what is race? Now, we know that the concept of a racial group comes from certain anthropological theories which have long been disproved. They were mostly developed in the late 19th and early 20th century in Western Europe and claimed that humans could be divided into racial groups based on physical and behavioural traits linked to ethnicity, nationality, and related concepts like shared language. Now, these theories were influenced by colonialism and imperialism and the desire to show that non-white groups were inferior in order to justify actions of Western nations. Now, the current use of the terms race and racial have developed because these false notions of racial difference have become embedded in the beliefs and behaviours of society, especially in Western nations. And these notions influence all areas of life in Scotland to some degree, from social attitudes to the way organisations are run, making inequalities for Black and minority ethnic people continue over generations. And this is known as structural racism. It can be seen on a personal level in people's attitudes and behaviours, on a social level in how people talk to each other and make decisions, and on an institutional level in how organisations conduct their business. Now, race is strongly linked to skin colour. White populations across the world were not racialised in the same way non-white populations were. So although there are stereotypes about white minority ethnic groups in Scotland, and these groups can face prejudice and discrimination, this would be described as xenophobic prejudice rather than racism. So why does racism exist in Scotland? So for many hundreds of years, white British society has enjoyed a position of economic, social and political power over non-white people in Britain and across the world through empire and colonialism and their after effects. Although people in Scotland often know little about this history, the social attitudes that developed over this time are still present in our society. And this is known as white ideology or sometimes as white supremacy. Now, the advantages that this still brings to the white majority ethnic Scottish people are known as white privilege. And while individual white people may be against racism, they still benefit from the distribution of resources controlled by their group. And yes, an individual person of colour can sit at the tables of power, but the overwhelming majority of decision makers will be white. And yes, white people can have problems and face barriers, but systematic racism won't be one of them. And this distinction between individual prejudice and a system of unequal institutionalised racial power is fundamental. One cannot understand how racism functions today if one ignores group power relations. Now, white ideology, however, doesn't only affect white majority ethnic groups. Whiteness is not just about skin colour. Non-white groups can also be influenced by white ideology, reflecting it in their own attitudes and behaviours in order to benefit from some of the power it brings or reduce the risk of being discriminated against. Now, this would include, for instance, people being afraid to talk about racism for fear of offending their white friends. Those who speak out are often judged to have gone against the normal, for example, white ideological view that racism is uncommon and mostly about personal prejudice. And disrupting that view makes people who subscribe to it uncomfortable. Black and minority ethnic people, therefore, often put their white friends' feelings of sensitivity about race above their own need to address the racism they face. So at the most basic level, racism still exists in Scotland because white majority ethnic Scottish people are viewed as normal in comparison to other diverse communities. And someone doesn't have to feel hostile towards people from a minority ethnic group in order to have racist attitudes or to act in a racist way. So the fact that Black and minority ethnic people are constantly treated as being different, even if several generations of their family have been born in Scotland, means that they face racism to some degree throughout their lives. And someone's experience of racism is not about their ethnicity or appearance, but about other people's perception of those things and stereotypes that impact that perception. So the risk that someone will experience racism depends on whether the signs that they are not from the dominant ethnic group, for example, in our case, the white majority ethnic Scottish and or British, are visible to others. So I'm not racist, so why should anti-racism matter to me? Very few people could be fairly described as racists, but while individual white people may be against racism, they still benefit from the distribution of resources controlled by their group. Now, social scientists understand racism as a multidimensional and highly adaptive system, a system that ensures an unequal distribution of resources between racial groups. Because white people build and dominate all significant institutions, often at the expense of and on the uncompensated labour of other groups, their interests are embedded in the foundation of Western society. To foster a culture of structural change, we need to become anti-racist as a society. This means changing the way we think and act and being prepared to challenge ourselves and others to do the same. And many white people have extremely low thresholds for enduring any discomfort associated with challenges to their racial worldviews. So having an insight and understanding that whiteness is socialised into a deeply internalised sense of superiority and entitlement that we are either not consciously aware of or can never admit to ourselves, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. We experience a challenge to our racial worldview as a challenge to our very identities as good, moral people. It also challenges our sense of rightful place in the hierarchy. Thus, we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as a very unsettling and unfair moral offence. So structural racism is deeply ingrained in our society. The result of this is that minority ethnic people, especially those who are more visibly minority ethnic, experience everyday racism. This has a big impact on their lives. It pervades all areas of life and is hard to challenge. So in some ways, it can have a bigger impact than obvious forms of racism. And everyday racism acts to silence and demean minority ethnic people and reinforces the inequalities they face. Structural racism can't be dealt with simply by telling people it's wrong to be racist. It can't be dealt with by holding diversity events, which often reinforce perceptions of difference and racial stereotypes. We have to work together, collaborate, and find a way to build a bridge of trust between activists, academics, museum practitioners, and communities to carry the weight of the truth we're trying to deliver. And anti-racism is an active process that involves continuous learning and reflection. We might have make mistakes, but mistakes are where we learn. If we get it wrong, then we have to put it right. So recapping on some of the concepts that I talked about, when we're talking about white supremacy or white ideology, what we're talking about is a political, economic and cultural system in which white Western ideals control the power of the text, the material, resources and ideas of cultural superiority. And when we're thinking about white privilege and also complicity, how white people, communities and culture are centred in our society and valued above others, leading to white people having unequal and unfair access to opportunities and resources compared to Black minority ethnic people. And if we think back to, particularly in the 80s, where we talked about how, we're a multicultural society, I would argue that the issues with multicultural is white people didn't think that they were included in those policies and concepts, but they were. And white fragility, what we mean by that is when we have conversations about race and racism, white people become very defensive, they go into denial and resistance. So these are the concepts that I discuss and have conversations with academic and museum professionals. And I've been using this to help us to think about how does this show up within the functions and practices of our organisations, because we have to look at the inside before we start thinking about, well, what are we going to be looking like on the outside. So this graphic slide shows a conversation with museum professionals. And what we did was we collectively generate areas of museum function, theory and practice. And we think about the examples of the concepts that I've been talking about, such as white privilege and white ideology, and where does that show up in functions and practice? And in this case, it was a museum. And we list those categories, and then we list what it looks like within our institutions. And after we've had a discussion around that, we start to think about the list and think about each point of privilege. And we ask the question of, well, what concrete steps can we take to change structures to dismantle each privilege? And really the idea of this exercise is to enable us to discuss that interplay between structural change and personal action. It's people that make up institutions. We do have power to create the change if we want to. And in this slide, with some of the conversations we had with another organisation, was to think about using the same questions. Some of the things that they had thought about was thinking about creating opportunities for BME people to actively engage. So how do we do that? Acknowledgement of BME contributions and content. So acknowledging the stories of African, Caribbean and Asian people, really that's all we're saying here. And collaboration with wider teams. So thinking about even internally within the institutions, how do we cross-pollinate our experience and expertise and bring that together? And thinking about policies for working with community stakeholders. Often when institutions do community engagement exercises, no payment or no recourse goes to the communities. And as I talked about, often people of colour's emotional labour can be exploited. So it's about considering that and making sure that we don't do that. Thinking about collections direction and ensuring audience have influence over that. And rotating our hidden histories, rotating enslavement and other intersections and highlighting how our shared history is threaded through our collections. And decision-making being an open process, what we collect and who donates. And who did we get it from? Where did they get it from? So digging that a bit deeper. And also quite important is to facilitate access, looking at all the different ways that we can ensure that people from across society have access to these collections. And being mindful of ownership of language, language, whether that's within text labelling or whether that's when we're working with community groups, being mindful of the language and how that has a power dynamic behind it, and sharing power. How do we work collaboratively? How do we work with equity? And some of the ways we're attempting to do that at the Hunterian is through the project Curating Discomfort. So this is some of the Curating Discomfort project team. So you'll see myself, we have Arunima, Ezra, Nelson and Mary, who are community curators on the Curating Discomfort project team. And there's two more community curators who are not in the picture, which is Churnji and Yvonne. Now, part of the project team includes the community curators, but it also includes Hunterian staff from across teams. So again, trying to create a collaborative environment where we're cross-pollinating our knowledge and expertise. So it includes audience engagement, exhibition management, curation, collection management, all of that design, trying to collaborate, to work together so that we have an end product, end output, which will be an exhibition that is relevant, makes sense, draws in our stories and hopefully not perpetuate historical bias. And the community curators are multiracial, it's intersectional, multi-generational, and they bring a breadth of experience. So it's a mixture of people who are academic, retired, activists, it's all there. The team is responsible for an exhibition which should be on display in April this year. And we have been working together to create a brief, and we're at the stage now of going through an object list. It's not an easy process. In particular, under current situations where actually getting to meet face-to-face is much more complicated than it would have been before the pandemic. But we're still chipping away, we're working on it, and we're building what I would say is meaningful relationships. But what we started out with was a conversation. So the community curators, I posed and facilitated some questions that I posed to the community curators in preparation for the part of the Hunterian staff team who are on Curating Discomfort project, to kind of sit and listen and think about the things that actually mean something to us. So as you'll see in this graphic, some of the things that came up, when I asked the question, what's it like being Black in Scotland? That enabled us to have a conversation around colorism, around our different experiences, our history, our experiences of racism in Scotland. We also talked about issues around anger and how anger can be a good thing. We can use it as a source of good. We talked about how do we sustain the work of decolonisation and not make it just this kind of fad that's happening right now. We discuss how we display trauma, because many of these stories are pretty traumatic to us because we are talking about our culture and heritage. So very interesting work that the community creators were doing there. And you will see on the Hunterian website over the next few months some details about Curating Discomfort, the project, and what we've been working on in more detail. And I thought it would be good to show you some other ways that we're trying to represent our history and moving away from historical bias. So this was a social media post which I had written, and I had been having discussions with the curator of geology and the curator of paleontology at the Hunterian. And this is some text that I put together for a social media post. But what's most important about this text is I am centering the freedom fighters in the narrative. often when we talk about abolition, we talk about white abolitionists and we forget that it was actually captured African men and women themselves who emancipated themselves, who fought for their freedom, which enabled us to move towards abolition. And I also wanted to show you an example of how we present objects and belongings and how we display them and how we put narratives beside them. So this is a label I've taken a picture of from a museum that displays the Barbados pineapple penny. And it talks here about the penny trade token. It talks about the material culture, that it's copper. And it gives you a little narrative about who, what this token would be used for. Now, I became obsessed by the Barbados pineapple penny, as many of my colleagues at the Hunterian can testify to. So I started doing my own research on this. And as you can see, the label that I started to write, that I've written, is very different from the previous label. Again, introducing chattel slavery, which is when we walk about museums, we never see them talk about chattel slavery. They'll say slavery, and that conflates the hierarchy of slavery. And I think if we start presenting this in our labels, it will enable visitors to think about that. They can go and Google it, they can educate themselves, but we do have a responsibility to use the language and the words that actually describe exactly the inhuman practice of the transatlantic slave trade. And I'm going to end there, so thank you for listening.